From 1910 to 1930, this is what the Utah Valley looked like. A beautiful windswept valley with a lot of brush and a scarcity of trees. Now, most of us Utahns, we depict the pre-pioneer Utah Valley as an image of desolation and barren land. We hear the stories of how they came in and it just seemed like an impossible feat to farm. Granted, it kind of was insanely difficult to farm. However, a professor of geology named Richard Jackson did some research on what the Utah Valley really looked like. And this was in 1970. His insights show that the Utah Valley really wasn't as bad as we thought it ought to be. Granted, there wasn't a lot of timber, but there were creeks and streams running through the land. So despite the fact that Utah wasn't a forsaken desert, it still has and had limited resources. Glenn Leonard, the director of the LDS Museum of Church and Art, said concerning the pioneers, "They had left a lush farm area and came to an arid region. The soil was good, but the water was scarce. The seasons were short, so Brigham Young wisely scattered the people out into small communities so that they had the natural resources, the water and the soil and the community resources." So by developing small communities, these pioneers, they were able to flourish in a society within the limitations of their environment, really despite the fact that they had these limited natural resources.
Now here we see some photos of the Utah Valley today. The cities in the valley are backed up against the incredible Wasatch Range. While we still see greenery and trees, there is an increase in the number of lawns, large trees, and sprawling communities. The type of landscaping going on in these communities is far less conducive to wise natural resource management than the model of the scattered farming saints was. Based on these photos, one might think we are in any other rain-plenty, lush area of the United States. Another thing to note is how many of the plants that used to naturally grow in the brushlands of the valley have been replaced by grasses, trees, and non-native species. In contrast, current-day photos of the land just outside of suburbia still resemble the windswept brushlands of Utah 100 years ago. While it definitely is not what you or I would think of when we think of a typical burning hot desert, it still is a high mountain desert. Here in the beautiful Slate Canyon, the flora have adapted to their harsh conditions. The water flows seasonally in the riverbed, and the oaks, brushes, trees, and succulents all store water the best they can to endure long dry periods. The turquoise blue shrubs that we see are commonly called the big sagebrush. The hardy plant can endure long spells of drought and is very well adapted Utah native. Quercus gambleri, also known as the gamble oak, grows along the foothills and in the canyons, a beautiful and hardy shrub. These grow in the northern mountains of Utah. Knowing the native flora of the Utah Valley helps us to know the nature of the place we live in. If I grew up in Provo thinking that Kentucky bluegrass is native to my environment, well then, I don't really understand what Provo is. Knowing what plants naturally thrive in our environment can give us a better sense of belonging and a sense of place. We wonder and marvel at the stories of mountain men and Native Americans who knew everything that was edible and could read the land and sky like we might read a book. We can begin to establish a better connection with the place we live in by learning what the natural state of the land really is. Sadly, we don't see very much of the native flora without venturing into the canyons or far outside the city.
Unfortunately, over time, human interaction with the land has actually been detrimental to the native plants, the soil, and watershed here in Utah. Human disruption from the early 20th century on has been very destructive, such as the building of dams, redirecting streams, and excessive deforestation. And that continues to deteriorate the quality of this biosphere. Homeowners and businesses also contribute to the degradation of the environment, and that's through things like unsustainable landscaping, particularly the American, or I could say English lawn, since that's where we got it from. And for the middle class, lawns have been historically seen as a symbol of wealth and propriety, and I would even say for really just the rich class. In England, I mean, you'd have acres of land just covered in grass to show that you had so much money. Homeowners across the United States use 235 billion gallons of water on their lawns every year. even in desert climates such as Utah Valley. And this is using an inordinate amount of water to keep lawns and other landscaping green and beautiful. Maintaining a monoculture of turf grass requires the unnatural use of fertilizers, pesticides, and herbicides, which also harm non-target organisms or run off into the waterways. So another problem that comes with the lawn aesthetic is that it ties homeowners to dependence on lawn care products and practices that simultaneously damage the environment. With the technosphere outgrowing the biosphere, we citizens have a growing responsibility to care for our environment as individuals and within our cultures. The way that we can change these problems is by turning away from excessive consumerism and developing the self-discipline to prioritize the good of the environment over an aesthetic ideal in landscaping. An aesthetic ideal that's both non-sustainable and totally different from the natural flora of the Utah Valley. Our recommendation for what we can do to be better stewards of Utah is both beneficial to our sense of place here in Utah and also beneficial to us financially. So it's called xeriscaping. Xeriscaping, it's an alternative method of landscaping that's very beautiful at low impact on water usage, and it also uses the natural flora of the place that you live in. So watering a lawn for 30 minutes in the morning uses 240 gallons of water. That is about $26 a month. Moreover, that is 7,200 gallons of water per month. That's a lot of water. And xeriscaping actually requires very little water. If it's done more conservatively, you really shouldn't have to water the plants more than 3 times a year. Otherwise, it is enough to water the plants once a week. And the idea is that if you plant the plants that naturally grow in this environment, then you really shouldn't have to spend money on them other than to water them during a drought or to prune them and keep them looking nice. So that's the whole idea of xeriscaping.
Our conclusion is simply this: unless you need your lawn for something important like football, then rip it out. Invest in this valley's future and save a lot of money on water bills, fertilizer, and other expensive landscaping maintenance. We are not suggesting that we rip out everything non-native to Utah, but we are suggesting that a more conservative and sustainable approach to landscaping should take place in Utah. While it may not look like it, we are in a high mountain desert and water is a scarcity. We need to do what we can to conserve it by more natural and sustainable approaches to the way we cultivate our land. By transitioning to a more natural, resource-friendly approach to the way we landscape, we can save time, money, and more importantly, our natural resources.